two, one, two, three.
Hello, this is Ithaca DSA Presents, and I'm David Foote, activist and organizer with the Ithaca chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. We're speaking today with Suzy Lee, who is an immigration researcher and assistant professor at Binghamton University in the Human Development Department. So we're here today to talk about immigration. You've studied and written about this topic extensively, not just the data, what's out there, but people's opinions about it, how it connects to labor and policy, and a lot of things that really help to frame what is talked about or what isn't. So can you tell us, first of all, what is the conventional wisdom today? What opinions or viewpoints on immigration do we see in this country? And how does this connect to research?
I guess I'll start by saying, well, I'll answer the first question. What is the conventional viewpoint on immigration? When I write about it, I represent it as what the news media, and I think maybe often in conversations with other people I've picked up. And I think that conventional viewpoint is one that says that the problems that we have with immigration policy in the United States, so I guess I'll be speaking from the perspective of socialists who might have a human rights sort of critique of what's going on with immigration in the United States, right? But the problems that we have with immigration policy in the United States, the repression of immigrants, that all of these things are a function of racism in America, or the nativism of an American working class, of the white working class is often how it's presented, right? And that our politicians, when they pass legislation that further represses immigrants, when they implement policies that cage children, all of these things, that they're responding to a movement or a public demand for this sorts of behavior, right? And that that's driven by a nativist group, that there's some majority, a silent majority sometimes it's called, but sometimes it's assumed to be a much more vocal majority, right? That this is what the Trump Republicans want, and that even when there isn't a Trump in office, that our politicians have to take their demands and their wishes into account. And that's why we see the immigration policy that we have in our country. And then your second question was, what does the research show about this position? And I think that so it doesn't actually take that much scratching under the surface to find out that this is incorrect, right? That there is no, I won't say that there is no nativist right wing. We know that there are. We've seen plenty of evidence for the existence of this sort of movement in the United States. But I think that it's represented as being more powerful than it is. And when you actually have rigorous surveys that kind of measure the nativist views of Americans, or the views of the majority of Americans on immigration, what you find is that the vast majority of Americans, white or black, even Republicans or Democrats, are actually opposed to the repression of the immigration system as it exists, that they actually support policies that we've been told are quite controversial, like amnesty for immigrants who are here without papers, that actually we're much more, I won't say the word liberal because that sets people off, but that we're much more humanitarian and open towards immigration, or at least the extension of human rights to immigrants, than our public discourse would, or the media and the public discourse would have us believe.
Yeah, so in approaching this topic, the article that was, I think, the basis for us wanting to schedule this interview was titled "The Case for Open Borders," which to me is a very intriguing option as we move towards thinking about justice, thinking about amnesty, thinking about treating people as they should be treated. So what do you mean by open borders, and can you lay out for us the case for opening them?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that the title is kind of a product of me being terrible at titles. So I don't like picking titles for things. And so I wrote the article, and then I sort of, couldn't pick a title and left it to the editors to decide. And they picked that one, which is, it's kind of controversial. I think it's kind of a clickbait title because Open Borders is a very, it's politically kind of it can be considered controversial, and people are interested in the question, but it's also one that's imprecise, I'd say, because open borders can mean a lot of different things, and so it can be confusing. But at the same time, I do think that in the end, there's a version of open borders that my argument supports. And what I'll say is the case for open borders, that I'm supporting is not the case for open borders that is like what the Koch brothers or what conservative libertarians might support, which is where we allow as many immigrants who might want to come in, but we refuse to extend them the same rights that citizens have, right? So we allow them to come in as guest workers, and we don't make any restrictions on this. Millions of guest workers can enter, but none of them can expect citizenship rights or labor rights or to be able to participate in our political process or to expect to build lives here, right? So that version of open borders is not the case that I'm making. The case for open borders that I am making is one that is for the unrestricted movement of people, but with the extension of full rights, so full political rights and social participation rights, right? That they can expect to come here and be treated. It's essentially the case for abolishing the distinction between American citizens and foreigners, between Native American. So Native American doesn't sound right, but in immigration research, when we talk about natives, we're talking about people who were born in the United States. So native-born Americans versus foreign-born Americans, right? That we make no distinction among workers based on where they were born or what their citizenship may be. So the case for, and that's arguably a much more radical vision of what we mean when we say open borders, and it's certainly a more socialist one. And I think that it's also one that can be controversial even among socialists because, and I can talk a little bit about that, but I think it's a position that needs to be defended. And my defense of it is based on actually what having a distinction between immigrant workers and foreign workers, or immigrant workers and native-born workers, does to the working class, right? That it's an arbitrary and it's an arbitrary distinction in terms of the structure of the class itself and class power, and it's one that is very harmful to solidarity. It's ripe for exploitation by capitalists who are trying to undermine working class movements. It sows division, and it weakens the working class. Now, I won't argue that it's the only reason that the working class is weak in the United States. There are many reasons, but I think that the immigrant native distinction is a very important cause for its weakness. And so I think that that's the reason. I mean, the article goes in much more depth about all these different things, but I think at the core, that's what this is about. That it's about making sure that if the working class is going to revive itself, it needs to get rid of that distinction.
Before we address some of the modern standpoints and contradictions that you've mentioned, talking a little bit about the historical context. The ways that immigration has been increased or limited based on both political and economic factors. You referenced the quota system, and I've found it interesting the way that immigration limitations or expansions have really shaped US history and US identity. So can you tell us, when does the government decide to open up the borders and when does it not?
Understanding that, I think, actually goes back to this thing that I said about working class power and the strength of the working class, and it kind of goes back to your first question, actually, about what are the prevailing or the what do people think what's the conventional view on immigration? Because I actually think that this myth of the conventional view that we took down is actually part of this. It's very key to understanding this whole process, right? That we think that borders get closed because people are nativist and racist and don't want other people in, and that's what's driving all of this stuff. So we would imagine that if we look historically, that the closing and opening of borders should reflect kind of, nativist sentiment, the waxing and waning of it, right? So when Americans are more xenophobic, then you would have more closed borders. When we're less xenophobic, we should have more open borders, something like this, right? But that's actually not the patterns that we see. What we see are patterns that are much more closely tied to the needs of capital, right? So, so how important are immigrant workers to the projects, the growth, economic development plans of American capitalists? And so, so it's actually the case that before the turn of the 20th century, so around 1900, although that's not a precise date, but around between like 1880 to 1920 is when we saw a big shift in immigration policy from what was actually quite open before. So I would say in migration in the 17th and 18th century was quite open, 19th century quite open, and then the 20th century is really the moment, at the beginning of the 20th century is really the moment when we start to see a restriction. The way I write it is that before the 20th century, what we had was an assumption of that in immigration law, you could assume that a person would be admitted to the United States. So there would have to be specific reasons why someone wouldn't be admitted, but most people could assume that they could get in. Whereas in the 20th century and now, what we have is the assumption of restriction, or that you won't be admitted unless you have a special reason to be admitted, right? So you need to have so I don't know how many of your readers are going to be familiar with immigration law, but if you've ever sort of had any run-ins with it, and you have to qualify under certain categories, right? You either have to have a job here, or you have to have family members who are going to support you here, or you're a refugee, but you have to have a specific reason for coming. Whereas before the 20th century, it was the opposite. You could come if you wanted, and then you had to have a specific reason to be excluded. And so that shift happens at the beginning of the 20th century, and there are lots of reasons why the U.S. was open. Some of it has to do with our settler colonialism, right? I don't know if you would exactly call it immigration, what happened in the 17th and 18th century, right? At the early parts of that time, it was more like you're trying to get as many white people here to take over the land as possible, but it was migration, we could put it that way, right? And migrants who came during this period could not only expect to be admitted, but they could be expected to receive political rights pretty quickly, right? That they would be able to have citizenship rights and the rights to vote without having to worry too much about being able to get those things. So the change that happens at the turn of the 20th century is that so the need for immigrants declines, right? So before the 20th century, so particularly in the 19th century, so if we say early on in American history, we needed settlers, and that's why we had this open immigration or open migration regime. The 19th century, America's population, we still need settlers, but we also have this huge industrialization drive. So America's going from a country that was mostly agrarian to one that was now competing with England and the European sort of advanced industrial economies. We're starting to build factories and making steel and trying to become growing economically. And these are one of the big industrial fortunes like Carnegie and these people. They emerge, and they need lots of labor to work in their factories, right? And America doesn't have that much. That it's not just that we don't have the population to support it, but even if our population is having tons of children, we also have this huge territory that we're taking over, and so there's always this sort of frontier that's sucking away work. People always have an option, or a lot of people have the option of not working in these factories. And factories are, I'm sure some of your audience is familiar with this, but we know what factories were like at the in the 19th century. They're not great now, but they're pretty terrible back then too. So it's not a choice that people would have made. And so you needed to have this constant. You need to have a source of labor, and so immigration was critical. Making sure that immigrants came in numbers large enough so that American industry could grow. It was a critical project to the national development. What happens at the turn of the 20th century is that the frontier closes, but also American population, different advances in technology, different things make it so that we now no longer have that dire labor shortage, right? You might still have moments where labor is harder to get or not, but we don't have this huge need. It's also the case that American industrialization has progressed far enough that its phase of rapid growth has stopped, right? And so capital doesn't need labor and immigrant labor in quite the same way that it needed in previous periods. And so what it means then is that, and so one of the ways that I characterize it is we say that that we should think about immigration immigration policy in two different ways: rights versus flows, right? And so we don't want to, and when I say that open borders we should think about, when we compare ourselves to like the conservative version of open borders, that they want flows without rights. And what socialists should want is flows and rights. Or maybe we don't necessarily want people to flow, they don't have to flow, but we want the flow to be unrestricted. We don't restrict the flow, and we want the rights also to be equivalent, right? That we want maximum rights for everyone. And so what happens in the 20th century is that capitalists don't need the flow as much, right? And when you don't need you don't need to attract immigrants as much, then you can change your strategy towards making sure that the ones who come are vulnerable to exploitation, maximizing their vulnerability to exploitation. And maximizing that vulnerability basically means making sure that they don't have rights. And so capitalist strategy moves from one where they need to secure the flow. So in the 19th century, you needed that flow of workers. And so what you were willing to negotiate on was on rights. So you could say, okay, I need like 1 million workers tomorrow, or I need 1 million workers yesterday. And so if those workers need to come with rights, if I'm not going to get those workers unless they come with, certain kinds of rights to vote and, different things, then okay, I'll let it happen. I don't care. I don't care. I would prefer them not to have rights, but I will negotiate on that if necessary. What happens in the 20th century is that most of capital no longer needs immigrant workers in the same way. They would love to have them, but only if they're going to be very docile, if they're going to be the kind of workers that are going to help their bottom line, right? If they're going to be workers who come and want to get organized, and want to participate in politics and do all this stuff, they don't necessarily need to have them, right? And so what you see then is that shift in politics where now the restrictionism in American immigration policy gets imposed at the moment when capital no longer needs immigrant workers enough to care about making sure that they have rights. And the reason that then you can also impose restrictions is that, if you come illegally or if you don't have rights, so if you have a regime of restrictions so that only some people can get in, it slows the flow, but immigrants might also come illegally, but immigrants who come illegally definitely don't have rights, right? And so all of those things that come with restriction, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a smaller flow, but it means that restriction makes it possible for immigrants to be made more vulnerable. And this is what we see that happens, at the change in American policy.
Yeah, that was something that I definitely picked up, that I've heard for a few decades, ever since I came into political consciousness, that this argument that allowing increased immigration would result in job losses. So it focuses on that ability of people to move across the border, not at all even on their rights once they've arrived. And I think that you've identified the ways that the policy on the left focuses on the rights, but concedes something in the process. And there was a quote from your article that I really appreciated. It said, "Examining working class nativism to address the problem of immigration is useful, though not because the working class is the cause of the repression of immigrants, but because working class mobilization is necessary to stopping it." So can you talk a little bit about the connection between immigration policies and the need to fight for the rights of all workers?
That quote kind of flows from what I said about capital being the place where we need to look to understand why we have a restrictionist regime, but also why there are human rights violations in relation to immigration. So the thing about capital is, and I'm sure your listeners know this, but the thing about capital is there's only one force in society that has the power to put limits on what capital does, right? To force capital to change its behaviors, right? And that's not, it's not immigrant rights groups, right? Which is unfortunate, right? As immigrants as a proportion of American society, they're too small, and immigrants rights groups don't control the levers that will make it so that capital will respond, right? The way that capital responds is that we have to hit their bottom line, right? And hitting their bottom line, sometimes you could do it with boycotts and that sort of stuff, but the most effective tool that we have seen so far in the era of capitalism is labor organizing, right? That labor, because they can withdraw, that workers, because they can withdraw their labor and basically bring production to a halt, can make capital do things that it doesn't want to do, that it's really the only force, right? And so what it means is if we have a problem with, and so if we say that immigration law, violations in human rights and immigration, that all of those things are actually not about what American workers want, but about what capital wants, right? Or, you know, it's all of those things are not about racist Americans, let's say. It's not about racist Americans, it's not about nativists or xenophobic Americans, but it's actually about what capital prefers, right? Then the only way that we can stop it from happening is by stopping capital from getting what it wants. And the only way, again, that we know to stop capital from getting what it wants is labor organizing, right? And so that's sort of the key that's important to it. The other, so it's sort of like I would say, it might be a vicious circle or a virtuous cycle. I think maybe we're caught in a vicious cycle, but what we want to end up is moving into a virtuous cycle, because the thing is, to make immigrant human rights improve, we need to get labor organized. The problem is, and we need to get labor organized in order, we need to get labor strong enough, but also to care enough about immigration so that they can use that strength to force capital to, or to kind of fight capital on the question of immigration and win. Now, it becomes a virtuous or vicious cycle because part of the ability of labor to have the strength to do that has to do with immigrants, right? And the reason, and this is another part of this is another section in the article that I talk about, which is that immigrant workers aren't just a part of the working class, and that's, you know, and that's why we need to do that. That's why we need to protect their rights. Immigrant workers tend to be in places that are strategically important for labor and for capital, and that places where the struggle between capital and labor is important. And the reason I say that is because part of the reason why the labor movement is so weak in the United States, you know, some of it you could blame on, you know, union organizers not being effective, this and that, right? But one of the reasons is just because of neoliberal globalization, right? So much of our economy has changed. So many of our jobs can be offshored, right? Can be sent abroad. That labor can strike and maybe win that single battle, but they end up losing the war because then the jobs get sent to another country where labor is more docile, right? Or labor costs are cheaper. That we've seen this happen over and over and over again in the neoliberal period. And what that means then, so it means that labor overall is weak, but there are certain sectors in our economy where it's not possible to offshore that work as easily, right? And those are the sectors where labor still has some leverage, right? Where striking really still can make a difference, right? And those sectors, and the very reason that makes it so that capital can't export those jobs also means that those are the sectors where immigration is most likely to happen, right? Because they still want those jobs to be cheap, right? They still want to pay as little for that labor as possible, right? And so what that means is then they try to fill those jobs with cheap workers, and immigrant workers are, because of their vulnerability, right? Because of all the things I said before that makes them more exploitable, are cheaper workers. And so what you'll find if you look in American in our labor sector is that those sorts of sectors where labor is hard to offshore, so service work, agricultural work, which is obviously tied to the land, so you can't really send farming to another, you can't offshore our farming. I mean, you can import food, but you can't offshore the farming that we do. But also, so those are the two big sectors that I identify, but there are others like logistics. So Amazon warehouses, again, we can't move those warehouses that far away, right? Otherwise they won't be able to deliver things in time. So in all of those sorts of sectors, what you'll see is that there's a higher prevalence of immigrants working in those jobs than you would find in the general population, right? So immigrants make up about 15% of the labor force, but actually in something like agriculture, you might see numbers as high as 50%, right? So in California, you have a lot of immigrant workers doing this, but also in nursing, which is a field that you can't really send abroad, right? There, you see higher percentages, something like 22%. Also in the logistics sector, it's something more along like 20 to 25% of immigrant workers. And so in those places, you have more immigrants. So it means then that and those are also happens to be the places where if you strike an Amazon warehouse, you will hurt capital in a way that you can't if you strike at the restaurants, right? And so what it means then, although immigrant workers are in restaurant work too a lot, but so what it means then is that if we're going to organize those places, and because they're strategically important, they also happen to be those places where you have more immigrant workers. So organizing immigrant workers is very key to controlling those or winning in those places that are key to winning against capital overall, I guess. So it's kind of a long-winded way of talking about that. And so again, it's this sort of virtuous cycle. Organizing in those places and organizing immigrant workers is made easier by making sure that those workers have rights, right? Because if you don't have rights generally, then if you don't have political rights, right, and you don't have the right to organize, then you're not going to be able to participate. But even if American law says that all workers have the right to organize, immigrant workers as well, if you're constantly worried about being deported, or if you maybe you have maybe you have a work visa, but you know that your boss will fire you if you participate in, or your boss will find a reason to fire you if you participate in the union, then you're just going to be much less likely to be organized, right? And that, again, like I said, it weakens the working class as a whole. But if the working class is weak in those places where particularly it benefits us to be strong, so in Amazon warehouses, in agriculture, in these places where it might make a difference to organize, then that's sort of deadly for the working class, right? And so that's something that we have to keep in mind, that immigrants, the rights of immigrants, it's not just a humanitarian issue, but it's actually a strategically vital one.
Okay. Would you like to give just a quick final statement about what you see as the most important next step for immigration and worker empowerment?
I'd say we should just keep an eye on what's happening with the immigration legislation. On the first day of the inauguration, Biden announced this major immigration reform, and today the bill actually was sent to Congress, and it's asking for a lot of stuff. But it's also, and in some ways it's a progress from the Obama era, which was still problematic. But there's a lot of skepticism that this law will actually pass, right? And that what will end up is sort of mired in the same sort of like controversies around immigration that we were in the past, where immigrants are, maybe they're not repressed at the level that they were under the Trump administration, but they still, but that we're still sort of talking about, what immigrants can come in and which immigrants we need to keep out and this sort of stuff, right? And I think that's the most important thing that we have to do in the Biden era is, if he's going to be supportive of immigration, that we have to push towards a more radical support, right? That we move away from the language of, the kinds of immigrants that we want to come in, towards talking about a more open immigration regime generally that will create the conditions for labor to be able to organize.
Well, thank you so much, Suzy, for joining us today. Again, my name is David. I'm your host with Ithaca Democratic Socialists of America, talking with Suzy Lee, who is an immigration researcher and assistant professor at Binghamton University in the Human Development Department.